They slapped a $250,000 fine on my property, claiming I'd violated every rule in the book. I couldn't believe it. My own land was under siege, and the people enforcing it didn't even know the truth. Every letter, every threat, every inspection felt like a personal attack. The community I thought I belonged to had turned into a battlefield, and suddenly my backyard wasn't just my home. It was a war zone. But here's the kicker. What they didn't realize is that I might actually hold the upper hand in ways they can never imagine. How far would I go to turn the tables?
I had always thought of my little suburban neighborhood as the perfect place to settle down. Tree-lined streets, friendly neighbors who waved when you passed, weekend barbecues that smelled of grilled burgers and laughter. It felt like home. My house, a modest two-story with a small garden out front, had been my dream for years. I spent evenings planting flowers, mornings jogging past the quiet streets, and weekends tinkering in my garage, blissfully unaware that everything could change in an instant.
Life was predictable in the best way, until the notices started showing up. At first, it was small stuff. A warning about the height of my hedge, a note questioning the paint color I'd chosen for my garage door. I brushed them off, thinking it was just minor oversight, maybe an overzealous HOA volunteer trying to keep the community picture perfect. But deep down, a knot of unease had begun to grow. Something felt off. Why would such tiny choices on my property suddenly draw so much scrutiny? Even my neighbors started acting strangely. Polite smiles seemed tighter, casual waves a little forced. Rumors circulated, whispers about stricter rules, about fines for things I hadn't even thought could be wrong. My heart sank with each letter that arrived in the mail. It wasn't just about rules anymore. It felt personal, targeted. And though I didn't know it yet, the tiny, invisible cracks forming in the seemingly perfect community were about to become a full-blown storm, and I was standing right in the middle of it. After those first warning letters, things quickly spiraled out of control. At first, it was subtle. Small notes left in my mailbox, always typed on official letterhead, always signed by someone I'd never met in person. "Please rectify the issue with your hedge immediately," one read. Another insisted I repaint my garage door in the community-approved color. I thought I could ignore them, assuming this was standard HOA oversight, but it soon became clear it wasn't. The letters kept coming, each one more aggressive than the last, and every visit from the HOA's inspectors felt like an invasion. It wasn't long before the fines started. At first, it was minor, $100 for a minor lawn violation, $250 for a non-compliant flower bed. I paid them reluctantly, assuming it was easier than fighting. But then a $2,500 notice arrived, citing an obscure clause about driveway widths. I read it over and over, confused. How could my two-car driveway, exactly like every other house on the street, be out of compliance? My frustration turned to disbelief, then to anger. I began documenting everything, taking pictures, recording baits, saving letters. I started noticing patterns. Every fine seemed targeted, and every inspection coincided with times when I was busy or out of town. Neighbors began to whisper. Some tried to warn me, sharing stories of other residents who had been harassed for trivial infractions. Others stayed silent, clearly afraid of attracting attention from the HOA themselves. My social circle in the neighborhood grew smaller as the tension escalated. Even routine things like leaving my trash bins out overnight became opportunities for the HOA to issue citations. Every day felt like walking through a minefield. Then came the notice that changed everything. A $250,000 fine for alleged unauthorized structures on my property. My stomach dropped. Unauthorized structures? I had a shed that had been there for years and a small patio I had built according to the city's code. The letter listed dozens of supposed violations, each more absurd than the last. I tried calling the HOA, emailing, pleading, even showing receipts and permits. No one responded. Every attempt to reason with them was met with silence or curt, legalistic replies that hinted at their power but never explained their reasoning. Frustration gave way to paranoia. I started keeping a log of every encounter, every inspection, every whispered conversation from neighbors. The sense of being watched was overwhelming. Security cameras, previously installed for peace of mind, now felt like a necessity to document potential harassment. Even simple outdoor activities, gardening, barbecuing, relaxing on my porch, felt scrutinized, judged, and potentially punishable. It wasn't just about rules anymore. It was about control.
And then, just when I thought I had reached my limit, the HOA stepped up their game. One morning, I discovered my mailbox had been tampered with. Official notices had been removed, some shredded, others left open for the world to see. Someone had walked onto my property in the middle of the night, leaving tiny markers in my yard as if to signal their omnipresence. I began receiving calls at all hours from unknown numbers, claiming to be concerned neighbors reporting violations. The harassment was relentless, and the fines were climbing. At this point, I knew I had to fight back, but I couldn't predict how far this battle would go. The HOA had power, connections, and rules stacked in their favor. I was just one homeowner trying to protect what was mine. I began consulting lawyers, researching obscure zoning laws, and digging into HOA statutes. Each new discovery revealed just how much gray area existed in their rules, and how easily they had weaponized them against me. Every time I thought I had a moment of relief, another fine or notice would arrive. One particularly shocking morning, I found a letter claiming I had violated regulations about property appearance, citing a crack in my driveway that had existed for years. The language was intentionally vague, leaving me with no clear way to comply. It felt as if the HOA's goal wasn't community standards, but to wear me down, emotionally, financially, psychologically. Amid the chaos, the neighborhood itself seemed to shift. Some neighbors took sides, others distanced themselves, and a few approached me quietly, sharing their own horror stories. It became clear that this wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern, a system designed to enforce compliance through intimidation. I started seeing the HOA meetings from a new perspective. The hand-picked board members, the secretive discussions, and the way rules were enforced arbitrarily. What had seemed like community governance was actually a machine for control and profit. The tension hit a boiling point when they tried to block my access to city permits for new landscaping. Suddenly, I wasn't just fighting fines or harassment. I was being denied the ability to legally maintain my own property. Every day brought a new challenge, a new bureaucratic roadblock, and I realized that this dispute was no longer just about my house. It was about asserting rights, claiming ownership, and standing up to a system designed to crush dissent. And then, as if the universe wanted to test me further, I stumbled upon a shocking discovery. Documents buried in public records, legal filings, and historical property deeds revealed something incredible. The land I had purchased included ownership stakes that extended far beyond my lot. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Could it be true? Was it possible that the HOA had been fining me for violating rules on land that, legally speaking, was partially mine? It was a revelation that changed everything, and it set the stage for a confrontation that would not just challenge the HOA's authority, but completely turn the tables in ways no one could anticipate.
The day of the showdown arrived without warning. I had spent weeks preparing, poring over every legal document, every HOA bylaw, every obscure regulation I could find. I was armed not with weapons, but with knowledge, proof that the very people who had tormented me for months had underestimated me entirely. The letter confirming the date of the final review meeting had arrived with the usual cold formality, but this time I felt a strange calm. Months of harassment,
fines, and intimidation had led to this moment. I arrived early, the sun barely creeping over the rooftops, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns of my neighborhood. The HOA board, smug and self-assured, waited in the community center, their expressions a mix of irritation and curiosity. I could sense that they expected a nervous, submissive homeowner, someone who would bend under pressure. They had no idea what I had uncovered, or what I was about to do. The meeting began with the usual formalities. Chairs scraped against the floor, pens clicked across legal pads, and a projector displayed a slideshow of violations and non-compliance issues, supposedly tied to my property. I listened quietly, taking notes, letting each absurd accusation hang in the air. The tension in the room was palpable. Every board member seemed to radiate authority, as if the weight of their power alone could crush me. Then it was my turn. I stood slowly, projecting calm confidence, even as my heart pounded. I began methodically, dismantling their claims one by one. Each citation was countered with documentation, permits, city approvals, photographs, witness statements. My voice didn't waver as I outlined the timeline of harassment, the inconsistencies in their inspections, and the outrageous financial penalties they had levied without cause. The room shifted subtly. Some board members leaned forward, others exchanged uneasy glances.
When I reached the revelation about the property ownership, the room went silent. I laid out the deeds, historical filings, and legal documents, showing that the land I owned extended far beyond my immediate lot. Their authority wasn't just challenged, it was undermined. The lines between compliance and control became clear for everyone to see. I emphasized that every fine, every inspection, every letter had been issued under the false assumption that they had unilateral control over land that partially belonged to me. A wave of shock washed over the board. One member sputtered, trying to interject, but I raised a hand and continued. I wasn't angry, I was resolute. Months of frustration had crystallized into a single purpose: to reclaim control over my property and expose the HOA's abuse of power. I highlighted the pattern of intimidation, the arbitrary enforcement of rules, and the financial and emotional toll it had taken, not just on me, but on others who had quietly suffered in silence. The tension escalated when one particularly aggressive board member demanded that I step outside, claiming I was disrupting proceedings. I remained seated, calm but unyielding, and responded that the meeting itself was under scrutiny. Every word I spoke was backed by legal fact and documented evidence. Their attempt to intimidate me into silence backfired spectacularly. By refusing to cower, I turned the room's energy against them. Next, I unveiled a surprise that had been months in the making: an audio recording of a private HOA board discussion. In it, members were heard laughing and plotting about how to target difficult homeowners and maximize fines for compliance leverage. The recording was damning. Smirks froze into expressions of panic. One member went pale, realizing that their clandestine scheming was now exposed. The room that had once felt like a courtroom now felt like a stage for public accountability. Then came the coup de grace. I announced that I had filed a formal appeal with the city, attaching all documentation, recordings, and evidence of harassment. I laid out the legal implications. Each unjust fine could be contested and possibly reversed, and the HOA's attempts to assert authority over land that partially belonged to me could constitute actionable overreach. The subtle power they had wielded for months was slipping from their grasp, and it was visible in the way they shifted uneasily in their seats. The room was tense, every board member aware that their authority had been fundamentally challenged. I paused, letting the weight of the moment sink in. Finally, I spoke. This isn't about revenge. It's about fairness, about accountability, about making sure that no one can wield power over others without consequence.
The question now isn't whether the fines will stand. It's whether this community can continue operating under the shadow of intimidation. A small cheer erupted from a few supportive neighbors who had quietly attended. It was the first visible sign that my struggle was not mine alone, that others had suffered, and that finally someone had stood up. The board's collective posture faltered. Arguments faltered. Threats lost their sting. Their power, meticulously constructed for months, was crumbling. As the meeting concluded, there was no formal declaration of victory. The HOA had no choice but to adjourn, leaving their next steps uncertain. I walked out into the afternoon sun, heart pounding, realizing that while the battle wasn't officially over, the tide had irrevocably turned. I had faced months of harassment, relentless intimidation, and financial threats, and emerged not just unbroken, but empowered.
The day of the showdown arrived without warning. I'd spent weeks preparing, poring over every legal document, every HOA bylaw, every obscure regulation I could find. I was armed not with weapons, but with knowledge. Proof that the very people who had tormented me for months had underestimated me entirely. The letter confirming the date of the final review meeting had arrived with the usual cold formality, but this time I felt a strange calm. Months of harassment, fines, and intimidation had led to this moment. I arrived early, the sun barely creeping over the rooftops, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns of my neighborhood. The HOA board, smug and self-assured, waited in the community center, their expressions a mix of irritation and curiosity. I could sense that they expected a nervous, submissive homeowner, someone who would bend under pressure. They had no idea what I had uncovered, or what I was about to do. The meeting began with the usual formalities. Chairs scraped against the floor, pens clicked across legal pads, and a projector displayed a slideshow of violations and non-compliance issues, supposedly tied to my property. I listened quietly, taking notes, letting each absurd accusation hang in the air. The tension in the room was palpable. Every board member seemed to radiate authority, as if the weight of their power alone could crush me. Then it was my turn. I stood slowly, projecting calm confidence, even as my heart pounded. I began methodically dismantling their claims one by one. Each citation was countered with documentation, permits, city approvals, photographs, witness statements. My voice didn't waver as I outlined the timeline of harassment, the inconsistencies in their inspections, and the outrageous financial penalties they had levied without cause. The room shifted subtly. Some board members leaned forward, others exchanged uneasy glances. So, imagine you're a foreign noble, an ambassador, or maybe just the unlucky cousin of a king. Winter has rolled in. You've been summoned to court, and now you're clattering across icy roads in a carriage that feels more like a meat locker on wheels. After days of cold travel, you finally see the towers of the royal castle rising in the distance. Relief, right? Warmth, food, comfort. Well, not exactly. Welcome to the guest experience in a medieval castle. First things first. Medieval hospitality was serious business. A king or queen had to impress their visitors, even if the castle itself was colder than a crypt. So, the good news, guests usually got better treatment than the servants. The bad news, they were still stuck inside the same stone freezer as everyone else. Guests were often assigned chambers, sometimes large, sometimes laughably small, depending on their status. These chambers might have been furnished with a bed, a fireplace, and some tapestries. The tapestries weren't just for decoration, they were basically medieval insulation. Without them, you'd wake up with frost on your eyebrows. Now, about the beds. Important guests often got borrowed beds.
Yes, castles didn't always have spare fancy beds just lying around. Instead, the household servants dismantled royal or noble beds, hauled them into guest rooms, and set them up with whatever fabrics they could spare. Imagine arriving at your cousin's house and being handed his second-best couch cushions, only with a side of mothballs and mildew. If you were truly important, say an ambassador from a powerful kingdom, you might get feather mattresses, silk sheets, and fur blankets. If you were less important, say the second cousin of a minor noble, you probably got straw stuffed in a sack and a scratchy wool cover. Hospitality was ranked, very literally, by how well you were insulated. And then there was the Great Hall. When castles overflowed with guests during festivals, hunts, or diplomatic gatherings, the hall became one big medieval sleepover. Nobles and lesser visitors spread out in rows, each with their own pallet or borrowed mattress. Picture a medieval version of a youth hostel, except colder, smellier, and much more jewelry clinging around. Privacy? Forget it. Curtains were a luxury. Most guests just curled up fully clothed under cloaks and blankets, hoping nobody stepped on them on the way to the garderobe. Speaking of garderobes, yes, guests had to deal with the same drafty toilet rooms as everyone else. Imagine stumbling through a freezing castle at night, torch in hand, trying to find the privy. The floor is stone, your toes are numb, and the only sound is the echo of your own shivering. 5-star medieval hospitality. Now, what about fireplaces in guest rooms? Some chambers had them, but remember, fireplaces were inefficient, and unless a servant stayed up all night feeding the flames, the fire died and the room reverted to refrigerator mode, which meant most guests went to bed bundled in cloaks, hats, gloves, and maybe even boots. Yes, nobles sometimes slept in boots. Not exactly the take-off-your-shoes-and-relax vibe. To cope with the cold, wealthy guests sometimes traveled with their own bedding. Feather mattresses, fur-lined blankets, even portable bed frames. Whole entourages of servants carried these items, ensuring that their masters could at least sleep on familiar straw. Imagine turning up to your friend's house for a sleepover with your own mattress and curtains. That's basically what rich medieval guests did. But here's the funny part. Despite the discomfort, being a guest in a castle was still considered a privilege. You were surrounded by feasts, music, entertainment, and political gossip. Sleeping in a freezing room was just the price of admission. And besides, everyone else was cold too. Misery loves company, and nothing bonded medieval nobles faster than the shared experience of shivering under inadequate blankets. Let's talk about really important guests. Kings visiting other kings, queens visiting foreign courts. These visits were rare, but when they happened, the hosting castle went all out. Chambers were redecorated, extra fires were lit, furs borrowed from treasuries, and the best mattresses dragged out of storage. But again, stone is stone. Even if the walls were covered in chroniclers sometimes describe foreign royals politely praising the hospitality, while privately complaining about the cold. Diplomacy was hard enough without frostbite. And then there were pilgrims. Not all guests were nobles. Some castles hosted traveling pilgrims or clergy. These guests usually got the bare minimum: a place on the floor, maybe some straw, and a thin blanket if they were lucky. Hospitality was an obligation, but nobody wasted luxury on a wandering monk. Pilgrims were expected to be grateful for the roof alone, never mind that their teeth chattered all night. Interestingly, the concept of guest chambers became more elaborate in the late Middle Ages and Renaissance. By then, wealthier courts had entire suites designed for visitors, complete with multiple rooms and private fireplaces. But in the earlier medieval centuries, most castles were still improvising. A chamber meant 4 stone walls, a bed frame, and maybe a servant to poke the fire once before disappearing for the night. And let's not forget winter travel itself. Guests often arrived half frozen before they even saw the castle gates. Roads were muddy, icy, or impassable. Carriages were open to the wind. Horses slipped on frozen ground. By the time visitors stumbled into the great hall, they were already shivering wrecks. So even a drafty chamber felt like an upgrade. The first sip of hot wine by the hearth must have tasted like heaven.